Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris. I buy records. I would not describe myself as an audiophile. However, I do like really nice pressings of records. Who doesn't? However, audiophiles have been a real chagrin of my life for quite some time, dipping into the community, seeing what people are talking about. So I thought I would address some of those concerns, some of those thoughts with you today. I'm not an expert, but I am opinionated. So this week, I believe it was this week, it was announced that Kraft were doing a small batch pressing of a Vince Guaraldi trio album, a soundtrack to a film that I must admit I've not heard of. There's a lot of talk about the fact that Kraft have jumped the shark on this. This record is not particularly sought after, it's not a particularly rare record, and it's not a particularly expensive record. And it led me to believe what something I've thought of for quite a while, which is that there is an innate snobbery with both labels and with collectors to buying records of a certain calibre. And I think that what really got me, certainly over the past couple of weeks, is the announcement of the Analog Production UHQR pressings of all Steely Dan albums. Now, I'm a big Steely Dan fan. I'm not normally a rock guy. I'm really not. I'm into jazz, soul, funk, things like that. A little bit of rock. You know, I'm white in English. Of course I like a little bit of rock. Okay, so Gaucho, right? Steely Dan, you all know this. You all know this. You can buy this cheaply enough. This is a UK MCA. You all know this record. This is an unbelievably good sounding record. I picked this up for a £5. Fair enough. The bubble's burst a little bit. No, it hasn't. The bubble is still going. Sorry. On a lot of these records, you can't buy records that cheaply anymore. That's a given. But that record is neither rare, nor is it particularly expensive. However, Chad Kasem, or as the Reverend Rock and Roller likes to call him, Chaddy Cakes, which I might go with, in the UK, to buy a UHQR pressing will cost £185. That means, doing some rough maths, to get all the Steely Dan albums, and to be honest, why wouldn't you want all the Steely Dan albums in the best quality that you can get them, would cost £1,665, not including shipping. That is prohibitively expensive. I won't be doing it, and yet, I don't know if it's FOMO or whatever, but I'm kind of gutted that I can't do that. Gaucho, Asia, they would sound incredible using the UHQR treatment. I am in no doubt of that. They will sound incredible. Asia's a good example, actually, because Asia is a record that, certainly in this country, it's not that easy to get the very best pressing. So I've done some research into this. The best pressing you can buy is I believe it's the second US pressing. There are smatterings of them about, especially in Europe, but trying to get a clean one is really, really difficult. My copy is a back to black one. I had an original UK pressing, but it had been played to death. It was kind of, a little bit worn. It didn't sound as crisp and as whatever as I'd like. So therefore the back to black, which by no means is a good pressing, but that's the one I have. My Gaucho, on the other hand, this is a fantastic pressing. This is, as I say, a first UK. It sounds just as you'd like it. There's so much detail, so much warmth in the recording. Now, while I'm in no doubt that the UHQR will improve on that, will it improve on that to the tune of £185? Now, I know what some of the Americans who may be watching will say. They will say, well, hang on, where are you getting that figure from? But the thing is that there's a huge import levy on us here in post-Brexit Britain. We can add on roughly 50 quid for a price of a record, easily. If I was to import it, I would be spending $60 at least to actually ship it over here. So it's an incredibly expensive procedure. But I kind of get the impression that, and I know that plans were probably in place well before this, but I'm kind of getting the impression that Mr. Kasem is capitalising on the whole Mofi scandal of them using DSD files. So I've actually got some thoughts on that as well. Now, I know that I'm really, really late to this. I've been collecting thoughts around the Mofi scandal for quite some time. And at risk of offending a lot of people, I believe that the only reason that there is a controversy with mobile fidelity is effectively because we were all led to believe that we could hear digital. And you know what? We couldn't. I think that the whole concept of saying that Mofi deliberately misled us by basically not challenging our assumptions based on their practice is ridiculous. I really do. I have here, I own one step. I have the information card. I saw someone who was talking about this, and they were talking about how outraged they were because it clearly says there, original master recording, and then the steps that the record goes in, and they were saying, well, that is deliberately misleading because they are saying that, you know, the master tape to the disc, blah, blah, blah. But they're not. That's not what they're saying. Look at it again. It says original master recording. It does not say what form that original master recording takes. People who think that Mofi misled them really need to look into the trading standards policies of wherever they're from. Because at no point here or anywhere of any of the Mofi records that I own does it say explicitly that they are an all analog thing. If you look at Speaker's Corner, if you look at Analog Productions, look at Music Matters, look at Tone Poet, look at Classic Vinyl, whatever, they will all say all analog cut. Mofi have never claimed that. So why the controversy? Simply because people who thought that they were experts on these things are now thinking, shit, I'm not. And that hurts. That hurts. I have a TikTok. I have 3 videos about records on my TikTok. I don't really know why I've got it. It's a really easy thing to do. People seem to like it. I give, consumer advice mainly for people who are just starting out. I've made videos on there before this controversy, and I have said, oh no, you can always tell when something is digital. You can't tell. You can't tell. My Mingus One Step sounds far and away better than any other version of that record that I've heard. Personally, I don't care that it's got a DSD step in there. If that makes it better to listen to, I'm happy with that. The other thing is that why aren't more people really excited about the potential of using a digital step? Think about it. Master tapes, they're a fragile thing. Some of them are 50, 60, 70 years old. If we are preserving them to, especially the 256 DSD, if we're preserving them as that means that we can have records in print almost indefinitely using that same crystal clear kind of step. Why do we assume that it being all analog is somehow a better representation of what is on that tape? There might be a good reason. There might be a reason that I've not considered. Is it about is it about quality, or is it about authenticity? As record buyers and listeners, do we assume that we actually don't want things to sound like representations of what was recorded? We actually want them to sound like representations of themselves. We want that mimicking experience of someone who went into a record shop and picked up a first pressing of Miles Davis Milestones and put it on with all of its flaws and all of its, all of those little tiny errors that all records have. But it gives like an impression of authenticity. An interesting point, the 1960s Miles Davis catalogue, which, Mobile Fidelity did a fantastic job with. Most people, before the scandal, most people were saying, these improve upon the records that were released in the 60s, the first, second pressings, because they were flawed pressings. There was issues going on with the plants at the time. They were bashed out quite quickly, like all records in those days were. It's just a really interesting thing to me that as record collectors, we kind of have this impression that we are owed something extraordinary when we are given something extraordinary. And believe me, the Mofi records, certainly in my collection, and I don't have loads, but they are amazing records. My first, which was the Superfly, Curtis Mayfield, which actually is all analog, it turns out. They're just incredible sounding records. But why aren't we why are we always harping on about the sourcing? Why do we think the sourcing is where the quality of a record will come from? Why aren't we asking about mastering? Don't get me wrong, I don't listen to CDs. I don't listen to SACDs or anything like that. I would, I don't have the player, I can't afford to buy the player. But the mastering of something surely matters a whole lot more than where it was sourced from. You can take a master tape and do a flat transfer of it and it sounds like absolute shite. I'm convinced you can. In fact, that's happened. One of the things that Michael Fremer, more on him later, Michael Fremer said, you know, the first pressings of John Coltrane's A Love Supreme, extremely flawed. There was a mistake on that master tape. Actually, I'm not sure if it was the master tape or if it was a mistake that the mastering engineer made when he pressed the record, but some of those have an audible thing. The first pressings of that record are not the best. The acoustic sounds version from last year, year before, can't remember, stunning, absolutely stunning. So that's kind of what I have to say on that. I find it just really interesting, and it just seems to me that it's about snobbery rather than a realism. But maybe, just maybe, and this is something I've kind of thought about quite a lot, and this goes back to Michael Fremer. Maybe the reason that we are getting so outraged about the digital steps in Mofi, that we are, you know, supporting companies making UHQRs of 9 Steely Dan albums, that we're supporting companies that make, you know, luxury artisan pressings of readily available records. Is it simply because we think that people new to the hobby, people even not so new to the hobby, that somehow these people shouldn't be entitled to the records that we're listening to? And that to me is really sad, because I think that everyone has a right to hear music the way they want to. I think that everyone has a right to hear the best quality that they can and, you know, and can afford to. If you don't want to buy a tone poet for 35 quid, which is fine, that's a lot of money for a record, let's be honest. There are the, you know, the Blue Note 75th anniversary series. Yeah, they're not quite as good. You can kind of tell. They're not masters as well. They're not as warm. They're not as rich. There's not as much, you know, there's not as much response and tightness in those recordings, but they're good enough. Which brings me on to what I would like to project, sort of moving on with where I would like to see the vinyl community to end up. Which is basically people who have what I would like to call everyday systems, which, let's be honest, is the vast majority of us. Most of us do not have Lindex powered through Macintosh preamps and valve-based amps, you know, going through 10, 15, 20,000 pound speakers. We don't have that. So why don't we start thinking about the records that sound good on the systems that we have? I'm talking about Riga's P1, P2, P3, Project Debut Carbons, you know, those sorts of things. Audio-Technica LP 120s. These are the things that people, you know, these are the systems that people have. Most people out there don't actually have moving coil cartridges. They don't have cones. They don't run tubes. Therefore, one steps, the vast quality difference that people like Michael Fremer talks about, like Michael 45 RPM talks about, like Mike Exposito to a certain extent from the In-Groove talks about, you're not going to have this gulf of difference between the Mofi one step of Mingus RM and the music on vinyl Mingus RM necessarily. And that, I think, would be a really interesting topic to discuss, because there is quality out there. Quality is important, but it's not the be-all end-all dependent on system. And also, and this is a memo to me as much as it is for anyone who might be watching and nodding their head and agreeing to this, let's try and focus as hard as we can on the music that we are listening to, and not listening to the ambience of it, to the sound of the room, to all that kind of stuff. Because while that enhances your experience, and it does, no one can deny it does, while that will enhance your experience, it doesn't make it. It is more important to value the music on an artistic level than it is on any kind of technical one. My name's Chris. If you agree with me, I'd love to have a comment. But failing that, I'll see you again very soon.